Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode. On the Global Missions Podcast, we often talk about unreached people groups, those who have little or no access to the gospel. Many of those unreached people groups now, in our days, are in areas of the world that many would consider dangerous. Engaging those unreached people groups may include significant risk for cross-cultural workers. It might be physical risk or health risk, spiritual. There are, of course, many types of risk. Today, we'll be talking again with Anna, who we have interviewed previously on this program, about some ideas that can help both goers and senders develop a biblical theology of risk. Our guest today is Dr. Anna Hampton, who lived and worked for a significant part of her life in the Middle East. It included Afghanistan and Turkey. She's an author of a fairly recent book, 2016, entitled Facing Danger, A Guide Through Risk. And she also writes at her blog, which is called Behind the Veil, a public journal of a hidden life. Anna writes from her own experiences of facing sometimes overwhelming obstacles while living in an extremist environment and raising 3 children. Anna, how old were your children at the time you lived in Afghanistan?
They were from babies, actually. I would say 0, 2, and 4.
Wow. Little children in a very intense environment. And those children are growing up, of course. They've lived in other places, I know. Anna is a Bible teacher and a conference speaker, and together with her husband, Neil, serves with Barnabas International, where they shepherd cross-cultural workers in closed countries. Anna, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Megs. It's good to be with you. I was surprised when I looked to see it's already been since 2016.
It is amazing. So we're recording this in the fall of 2020. And of course, this is the year that we have known affected so deeply by the COVID pandemic. And it comes relevant to our topic today as we talk about risk. I have appreciated this book. I'm just going to quickly put in a plug. Anna can speak to it as well, but I want our listeners to know that I have picked up this book. I want a quick story. Last fall, I was at a conference and there was a table of books out, as there are at many conferences. And I love books, so I'm looking over the books and I picked up your book, Anna, and I didn't immediately connect the name that I had spoken to you on the podcast and the book. I just had it up. I was looking through it. I checked the table of contents as I do, and I was flipping through it. And already realizing, even very quickly, this is going to be a very practical, very helpful book. A gentleman standing beside me was also looking books. He looked over and he saw that I had your book in my hand. And he said, "Do you not have a copy of that book?" And I said, "Actually, no, but I'm seriously considering it." He said, "You need to buy and read that book." And I said, "Okay." I was already there, but just so you know, there is at least this gentleman somewhere out there. I don't know who he was or is, and I am glad to give it a really warm endorsement. This is a book that will help leaders, it will help missionaries, it could help churches as well think through, evaluate risk, and have a healthy unpacking of this really important topic. So there is my plug for Facing Danger. Thank you for all your work on the book, Anna.
Oh, thanks for that encouragement. It's so sweet. I do need to hear it because sometimes I just feel like I'm working in isolation. So those testimonies help me keep going.
That's good. So why do mission workers, or missionaries, we'll call them workers probably today, why do workers and sending churches need to give attention to the topic of risk?
Well, that's a great question. People often have thought that a theology of risk is synonymous to a theology of suffering. And I quickly experienced in Afghanistan that it wasn't so, that they were not synonymous. We went to Afghanistan ready with our theology of suffering, knowing we would suffer. But risk is this experience where the threats are piling in. There's uncertainty. You don't know what reality is, but you actually haven't suffered yet. But the suffering you're facing is potentially extreme, all the way up to death. And so that's why it's like, well, how am I supposed to think about this? How am I supposed to talk about this? How am I supposed to make decisions in this? And so that's why it's worthy of taking time to really work this through for churches, but also for those global workers going almost anywhere in the world now these days.
Well, in 2020, we have this global concern now. We have a global risk that we all share in to a greater or lesser degree. And there are differences, certainly, in the way we can face this potential illness, of course. What are some of your observations as far as you've seen the North America Church engaging with this COVID-19 pandemic?
As I've watched the North American Church, from my observation, I have a few questions I wonder about. The first question is, are the churches seeing that what they are personally experiencing is very similar to what a worker feels on the field? So let me just kind of frame that for you real briefly. The situation we find ourselves in here in North America is we can't make sense of reality. The data is not reliable. It's opposing from one doctor to the next, from one expert to the next. The risk communication is confusing. We don't know how to make a decision. There's a lot of uncertainty about our livelihoods, about whether we can go to church, how big our groups can be, all those kinds of things. It's very chaotic. There's a lot of fear. So those are all experiences that both global workers experience, but also the persecuted church. The threats are coming in and we don't know what to do. What is the right way forward? That's my first question I've been wondering about the North American church.
It's creating an opportunity for us, if we see it, to actually identify to a greater degree with people that face this all the time.
Correct. The second question I wonder about is if the North American church, I kind of hate to lump it all together because there are some leaders that I don't think they're not shepherding the people well. And then there's many, many, many that are, right? And I don't have access to all of that. But I do wonder if my fellow brothers and sisters in North America see the idols that are being shaken within God's people, right? I'm not talking about the pagans and the secularists and all those people that we might disagree with. But do God's people see the idols that are being shaken within this? And one of those, I would say, is addiction to certainty. There's an addiction to certainty, both theologically and about which data set we're going to latch onto.
Interesting to use the term addiction with it, but our looking for it, our dependence upon it, our expectation of it, and who can hold to certainty right now? Not in very many fields. Yeah, we're going to have to find our certainty in places that we didn't previously, perhaps.
Right. And yeah, for those who risked their lives, and the Bible kind of delineates out those people who've actually risked their lives for the sake of the gospel. Peter, in Acts, he makes a certain observation that those who risked their lives were asked upon to enter into certain types of leadership experiences. And that's not to wrongly or falsely elevate them, but the point is my personal experience is it really strips away what you think is important, and you kind of zero in on those few things. And so I guess my desire is a North American church, and especially our leaders involved in sending workers, will kind of be able to see through reality of what's really important and what's not important, and what our real foundation is as we're working through all this COVID uncertainty.
Well, the last time we spoke, your book actually hadn't been released, and we just touched in one of our questions. I went back and listened to that episode again before this interview. We talked about this just very quickly, the difference between a theology of risk and a theology of suffering. I want to unpack that today a little more, but let's just start with that basic difference. What is the difference between a theology of risk and of suffering?
Well, I would say a theology of risk has 3 core elements in there. And not all people are called to the types of risks that we're referring to, that you would experience when you go cross-culturally. My risk going to Afghanistan is much different than the risk of my family that's staying here and isn't putting their life on the line each time they go out go grocery shopping to the bazaar. I'm risking kidnapping and potentially rape and murder of myself. So, we have to have some way of talking about this, even though theoretically we all risk. There is a difference between making that choice to move into danger and the suffering that results versus Suffering is what all Christians experience. It's literally promised to us that we will all suffer in some way, right? But we're not going to all have the same risks.
Wow. And thinking that through, why is it important then that we think it through ahead of time? Why is it important for workers and churches to have a theology of risk?
Well, because we have to understand who's called to these types of risk. Before we started this interview, you were describing a situation, thinking through about a certain family, was whether they really are called to go at this time, right? And that was a big matter of discussion and prayer. So we really need to prayerfully talk through. One of the first key elements on that theology of risk is who is called to it, to that situation at that time. So it's who is called for it, because we're not all called and we can't all go, can we?
Right, right. Well, I know that we want to talk about these three major elements today, so let's go right to that and say the first element you're saying is who is called to engage in risk.
That's right. And so obviously there's an evaluation process that happens, and sending organizations and committees from, maybe the church is evaluating a candidate. That all is playing into that. Who is called at this time? And is that a situation that's going to be the type of situation that supports that worker in whatever they're called to do? There's a lot of elements that go into evaluating who's chosen for that situation.
That brings me back actually to your book in some ways, because it helped the case that you're referring to. It helped me make sure that I asked many of the right questions. It's hard to think of everything on your own, even well-intentioned. And so Anna's book does provide some frameworks to say, have you thought about these elements? And I think what you're saying is it also brings it into an intensely personal, and by that I mean it's related to a person or a family, and it's related in a time as well. The same decision might be made at a different time as well about a similar place. So there's all these factors together. Now, you said who is called. Do you find are there guidelines that churches can simply use to begin to ask these questions? Who is called?
I gave, let's see, on my blog, and I believe it's in the back of that book. I know it's in our 2-day training guide that we have. It gives basically 9 different categories of things to evaluate, not necessarily in order, even though right now they're kind of listed 1 through 9. And that gives more guidance than I even fleshed out in the book as far as some categories to think through. But again, it is complex in the sense of it's multifaceted. It's your physical health. If somebody has just an absolute ton of allergies and the place they're going doesn't have that kind of food, then they're going to physically, it might not be the right calling for them. That's just an easy example. But if we're looking at spiritual maturity, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be at a place of arrival, right? But are you aware? So I go into discerning spiritual awareness and maturity. And of course, psychological soundness, that's important because it's intense, the pressures on you in a cross-cultural situation. So there is some guides in there that can maybe be evaluated for a sending committee or an organization on what maybe they need to add or change within their evaluation process.
Very helpful, and I would call it almost a rubric that a church, a missions committee could use. Ask these questions, and that'll lead you to many. There may be secondary questions, but this will provide the starting points for that. Determine who is called and at what point are they called. Is this the right time?
Yeah.
Okay, so who is called is the first element. What's the second element of a theology of risk?
I would say a really, really important one is, what do we recognize is our foundation in risk, right? And it's easy to give the Sunday school answer here, but really, how are we actually living out our reliance on God as our foundation for our security? And so, one of the questions that we don't often get asked is, well, what's an idol? How do I know if I'm being idolatrous, even subtly? I was talking with a worker once about 3 years. And after 3 years of listening to her, I finally said, I think you've made ministry an idol. And I would encourage you to consider confessing that before the Lord. And she went away and prayed about it. And she recognized she'd made it an idol and that she needed to release it. She'd elevated ministry over God and not recognized it. And this isn't a high risk situation that she was in. So an idol is, what am I trusting in other than God? clinging to or relying upon. In other words, if it's taken away from me, or if this doesn't end up the way I want it to, it's going to completely undo me. I will be angry. I will be violent. I will be, just completely a mess and unable to function if I don't get my way in this. It could be like white knuckling, we say, on the steering wheel. What am I white knuckling my way through? Instead of recognizing that I need to rely upon God, trust in Him, cling to Him, rely on Him first and foremost. And any one of us, no matter what decade we're in walking with the Lord, we can subtly cling to an idol over Him.
That is such a helpful little triad, I think, just to identify that. What am I trusting in? What am I clinging to? What am I relying on? If any of those are other than fully on our sovereign, caring God, then we're at great risk of being off track. And yeah, just a very helpful starting point. I wonder, just your thoughts, quick, Anna, on how we can cultivate that before someone departs to go into a cross-cultural context.
That's a great question, because all the training in the world sometimes doesn't end up in a good situation. We've picked the wrong people. Right now, where I'm at, I would be looking for a couple of things. This isn't the end all, and this isn't the format to thoroughly go through the answer to that question. But if I had somebody who was always speaking, and here I am using the word always, with a binary viewpoint, it's either this or that, it's very simplistic, I would have a great deal of caution, because it would mean that their discernment muscle is not very strong. And what I mean by that is the risk situation, people think it's easy to name good and evil. Sometimes it's not easy. And, Hebrews 5:14 says that solid food is for the mature, for those whose senses are trained by practice to distinguish between good and evil. And I guess I would be looking for somebody who is a little bit more aware of the grayness of life, in the sense of the Bible doesn't address every single situation. It's going to require discernment. And our culture's addiction to certainty, we think that our interpretation of something theologically is the correct way or the only way. And this is where we really need reliance on the Holy Spirit, especially in the risk situation.
Wow, some great ideas there. I love one of those terms, discernment muscle. That is super. How do we build the discernment muscle? Excellent.
Yeah.
It's just not so easy to say black and white. It rarely will be.
It's rarely, and it requires senders who are able to be more comfortable with ambiguity. We would say ambiguity tolerance. In other words, you can't just give one simple answer to the risk situation, because it's situational, right? And it takes discernment, and that comes by asking some good questions, even the questions that are uncomfortable to ask.
Yes. I really appreciate that you have gently, respectfully raised that for the senders as well, because it's going to be true of the workers, the goers. We call them the goers on the podcast typically, those who will go, and then they're the senders. But sometimes these expectations, or the unhealthy, I'll even suggest maybe the idols, are being held by the sending community. And that can really entangle this. This is both and. We want to gently and respectfully say this is going to be healthy both for the goers and the senders, right?
Right. There's one key tool that I would just suggest for the listeners, and that is the 14 risk myths that I've written. And the sheet is available on my blog. I think we're going to make it available here. And there's both the uncorrected version, and then there's another sheet, the risk myth.
Yep.
We've so often encountered these among our own supporters in churches, and we've tried to gently give a response. And so writing these was like a cathartic debriefing for me. When I was actually wrote it for my dissertation, and it just started pouring out of my soul. It felt so good to recognize that these things that had been said to me and my husband were really not true. They weren't biblical. So
this is a chapter, it's chapter 9 in Anna's book, The Common Cross-Cultural Risk Myths. And just as an example, and we do talk about it in the previous episode, is you are never safer than when you were at the center of God's will. That's the number one myth that Anna puts in there. And frankly, it's just not true physically. If you talk about physical safety, that's being in the center of God's will may not be safe. It's going to be gray. It may not be the case. And so thanks for unpacking some of those there. Again, you can see the value of this book. It gives me the good opportunity to just mention to our listeners that we do take show notes. If you're a regular listener, you know this. But anything that by way of handouts or resources that Anna mentions, we will include in the show notes, and you can find those at globalmissionspodcast.com. Anna, as we were visiting offline, not during this part of the recording, you mentioned a difference between idols and biases, the biases that we sometimes have. Would you unpack that just a little bit, the difference and how this fits together?
Sure. It's important to know about our biases because part of what is the challenge in risk is knowing what decision to make about either whether we're supposed to move into the risk or away from the risk, and how we're to go about our day that day in risk, right? And so our biases affect how we interpret the data and see reality, right? And so if we see the data from, let's say, the confirmation bias, I'm looking for data that confirms what I'm already thinking, and I don't realize I'm doing that, then I'm going to interpret the data and reality based on that, and it's not actually reality. And then I do an action that it becomes repeated in risk, how I go about this, and then it actually can either lead us to the wrong decision, a bad decision, and eventually even it could lead back to that idolatry. And so our biases, it's important we become aware of them. And psychologists have identified just many biases. We talk about at least 8 in our RAM training.
Could you give them just a quick sampling of that so that we have a sense of the biases, even if it's not the whole list?
Yeah, sure. We could have authority bias. That means the leader who is saying what I want to hear, that's the one I'm going to go with. Okay. Common among goers is loss aversion. So the project becomes something I don't want to lose. And so all of my data interpretation and decision making is based on protecting the project, when in fact, God might be in his pleasure wanting to pour that out for his glory. And in other words, losing it, that is somehow for his glory, even though we can't see it in the moment. And that could include my own life.
Well, I'll appreciate seeing more about that. I understand that'll be in your next book, right? You're unpacking biases in the next book.
I'm going to probably unpack biases in the next book, which is on mature courage, a sequel to Facing Danger.
Very good. Well, we'll look forward to that. So actually, here we'll take a short break. We're going to ask Anna about the third element of a theology of risk in just a moment. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this mission resource, which we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Would you like to learn more about missions? Perspectives is a dynamic 15-week course where you'll learn more about God's global purpose and how He's at work in the world. You can hear more about Perspectives right here on the Global Missions Podcast by listening to episode 14 with Wayne Matthews. Go to perspectives.org or perspectivescanada.org to find a course near you. And now, back to today's conversation.
We are back with Anna Hampton, the author of Facing Danger, A Guide Through Risk, and we've discussed 2 elements of a theology of risk. Number 1, who is called? And number 2, what is our foundation in risk? Anna, what's the third element?
Well, the third element is risk as worship. What is our motivation for going into risk? Is it because, and I'm just going to speak for my ethnic group, my country, I'm an American cowboy and this is the Wild West and I'm just going to go forward? Is that my motivation because I think it's my pride or my glory, or I can even couch that in spiritual words and say it's for God's glory, but I'm really being a cowboy. And so the question would be is, what is God asking me to do here if it's going to be moving further into danger or leaving danger? Can I do that as worship no matter what people think of me? And how I go through the risk is as important as being in the risk. It's of no good. It doesn't glorify God if my relationships with my spouse, my family, my teammates, and the culture if I'm just angry all the time, if I have a lot of conflict. And I've seen global workers, you said the goers. I've seen two different goers on the field that were absolutely toxic and should not have been there. They were not handling the risk or the crises well in glorifying our Lord. And so it doesn't help us. It's not worshipful, and it doesn't draw people to Him if we are not moving through risk as an act of worship to our Father.
That's interesting to see how I'm confident that in some cases people would try and stay maybe in the risk and they think it's the right thing to stay. It's a sense of a duty, or it could be other unhealthy things, I guess, expectations of others. But it really is not grounded in the proper motivation. It's staying for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. If you're in a risk situation, that is like few of us get to have that kind of situation in life. I just view it as an honor to steward well with the Father in terms of what is He trying to transform within me so that I am more transformed to His likeness, but also what is He trying to do through my life in the risk situation to bring more to Him, which is what this whole thing is all about, is we want to bring people to know our Father and have eternal life with Him. And being in the risk, when you have your passport allows you to leave, that right there is a huge testimony to the people. And it matters very much how we're walking and living through risk.
Well, these principles about considering risk and forming a healthy theology of risk, the three items, again, I'll just add them again. Who is called? What's our foundation? And do we have worship as our motivation for staying or going to or departing from risk? Is it an element of worship there? This applies to just about any kind of risk we could talk about. If we go back pre-2020, pre-COVID, there are people departing to risky areas, and it could be because there are medical risks like a COVID. It could be political risk, physical risk. You mentioned living in Afghanistan, a place that was fraught with risk. I'd like to bring it forward, however, to this COVID season a little bit here, into COVID-19. What are some of the specific elements of risk that you see in this COVID-19 era?
Yeah, it just seems like we have the most information we've ever had, especially and related to COVID, but we can't make sense of reality. And that's exactly like, living under the threats in Afghanistan. What's the real threat? What's not the real threat? It's also hard to see what God is doing with COVID, especially in North America. And so I listen to the stories of where I hear God at work. There's moral confusion on what is the right way forward. So the debate on whether you should wear masks or not wear masks has become politicized. And there is this addiction to certainty, both theological and in action and even politics. There's a fear about security. There's all sorts of fears related to this. And the fear is related to our comfort being disturbed and our even some people are afraid about their health, even though they might know the Lord, they're afraid of the sickness. Those are all kind of playing into the situation in North America. And so we have an opportunity as a church in how we respond to display our Lord to those who are very afraid of getting sick and dying because they don't know where their eternity is.
Well, this really brings it, I'll say, home. You and I are North Americans. We're now sharing in this risk. To some degree, I think your book would have felt relevant to people who are going to Afghanistan. Thank you very much for sending us, helping us think through the hard places. But now it's here.
Yeah.
And these elements of thinking through risk, very appropriate to us. Do you think there are any additional questions or heightened questions that we need to consider as, we're thinking of sending people out in these days? Does anything change because of COVID?
Does anything change because of COVID and a pandemic? Because this whole pandemic has caught everybody by surprise. No mission organization, no business had pandemic in their risk mitigation, plan. So we're all going through this very fast and figuring that out. I really don't think there's anything special in relation to how we would deal with the COVID risk in terms of our theological, mental, or emotional approach. Certainly, we're going to have some different physical elements of how, the kind of health of the people we're sending out, what supplies we may send with them, certain, things like that we know would help with a sickness. But it will always help us if we face the risk square on, recognize what we're dealing with, and do the best in interpreting the data, and then wrestle with the Lord about that. And, the psalmist says in Psalm 46, this has been really meaningful to me in processing. He says, though the mountains fall in the sea, though the earth, just falls apart, essentially is what he's saying, I won't be afraid. God is my refuge and strength. Right? Now, when I say I won't be afraid, I want to quickly, I don't want to take up too much time here, but fear is a natural human reaction to a danger, right? So there's a lot of really bad preaching out there on fear. So when the psalmist says, I won't be afraid, it means he won't be paralyzed by fear because he's clinging to the Lord, and he knows no matter what happens in the world around us, he's safe because the Lord is his foundation. And we can take that with firm resolve that we are safe in God's hands no matter what happens, no matter if we get sick and we die.
It's a very good word. And there is a lot of confusion and fear, which has led to unhealthy responses, right? To our fractured safety because we don't feel safe. We're unsure.
Yeah.
Well, in these short conversations, we can only begin to unpack these topics. Anna, I'd like to ask you about resources. We've mentioned your book, of course, but if there are other things you think might be helpful to our listeners, what would you recommend to them?
Well, we have finally, because of COVID, we've become willing to do Zoom training. So Neil and I are offering our Zoom training in October and November, and we'll probably, I'm going to guess, offer one in January, February. The October one's already full. So this 2-day training, it's actually, because we can't do it live, it's on Zoom, we're doing it on 4 days to break it up.
Sure.
So that would be one resource. Another resource would be, if people haven't read Nick Ripken's book, The Insanity of God, I highly recommend that as kind of an addition. His is on really more of a theology of suffering, and mine is more on a theology of risk. That would be an excellent read, especially for senders, to understand some of the situations that workers find themselves in.
Super. And many of our listeners are senders. We thank you again. Those of you serving on missions committees or maybe helping on the pastoral team or elder team somehow to care for and to help prepare workers. A couple of fine resources. We will include all of that in the show notes as well. Well, Anna, this has been helpful again. I'm going to ask you one last question. If you had the opportunity to stand before a group of missions committee members and perhaps pastors who are influencing the churches, they want to do a great job of sending. They want to do a great job of sending ready workers. What would you like to say to them?
Wow, that is a great question. I would say, it is a sacrifice before the Lord when you have faced all the risks of the person or the entity that you're sending out, and you accept that risk. That increases both the endurance and the resiliency of the people you're sending when you've chosen to really face that and understand it as much as possible. And I have to say that living through risk where my life was threatened, he is worth it. He's worth it. And when you're in that experience, he gives you the grace. And so the senders can rely on our Lord that he will give the grace to those people that they're sending out potentially to death, especially when it's a high-risk situation. He will give the comfort and the grace and the strength to both the senders and the goers.
Yeah, such an important word. And may I add our high esteem and special prayers for the families who are sending, releasing their loved ones. We do not take lightly the cost of separation from family at any time, but particularly of sending out loved ones into risk, and how we are prayerful for you and want to be supportive of you as you share in the Great Commission by releasing your loved ones to serve, sometimes in great risk.
Yeah, let me just add one quick thing, Megs, just as a prayer of blessing for the senders particularly, is he will give, his Spirit gives discernment. It's not that we need more right theology. We need the Spirit's discernment. And 2 Thessalonians 3:5 says, May the Lord lead your hearts to express God's love and Christ's endurance. And that's my prayer for the North American church in these days.
Anna, thank you so much for spending this time with us again today, and may the Lord bless you and Neil as you serve. We're grateful for your book and for your ongoing ministry, and trust He will bless and lead you forward. Well, as we sign off today, I'd like to mention again the previous episode with Anna Hampton. It was number 24, entitled Myths and Truths About Risk in Missions. Also, Anna mentioned that her book has now been translated into Spanish and Portuguese. That might be of value to your community, and that other translations are possible, so we'll keep watch for that in the coming days. Today, we want to send a shout out to Bethany and Anna, a different Anna in this case, who are members of our podcast advisory group on behalf of Team International. We are really glad to cooperate with a group of other like-minded agencies as we seek to collaborate well in God's work. Bethany is actually transitioning off of the advisory group, but we wanted to mention how we appreciated her help with the first 2 interviews of this 6th season. Bethany, we'll miss you, but thanks for being part of this work with us. Today's episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies like Team International. Thanks for taking a moment to subscribe, and if you would take just a couple of minutes to leave us a review, we would be grateful. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.